big bearded tattoo guys such as myself probably shouldn't be making generalizations about millennials, or really any generalization or stereotyping of any group of people for that matter. But when it comes to millennials, it's not even like I have to. If you just Google the words millennials are, the things that you're gonna see come up, just absolutely get me. And the discourse over the past several years throughout businesses and in the boardrooms across the world has been around the issues that a lot of senior leaders have been facing with millennials, around things like engagement at work and the development or lack thereof of the human skills or the soft skills needed to be successful in those industries. Oh, and don't even get me started on the headlines that go on and on and on. I did so many Google searches, I couldn't find one positive headline about millennials, and it was just absolutely baffling. And it got I can keep going on and on and on, as you can see. And so many thought leaders who talked about their thoughts on the issues with millennials. And you know what? I'm not even going to define millennials and what they are today. I'm not even going to do that, because I think what we need to do is look at it differently. But ladies and gentlemen, if this is true, millennials, I'm sorry, we've got a problem. I mean, I say that in jest, but the gist is this. I think that my generation, the big bearded dudes of the world, we need to look at this a little differently. All of us need to look at this issue differently. And like I said, it's not about labeling the millennials, because the next generation, the Generation Zs, well, they haven't been faring any better either. And so I'm not even going to use that label. I'm just going to talk about the next generation, or the next group of human beings that are coming up to develop in the next phase of their lives. When we think of it in terms of what's needed to be successful, the World Economic Forum released very recently the skills that are going to be required going forward in 2020 and beyond. And it wasn't the technical skills. It was, again, those soft skills, those non-cognitive human skills that are going to be so necessary. But how are we developing those skills? How are we developing the next generation of bankers and lawyers and doctors? Well, what about the next generation of people who animate our favorite TV shows? Or do the special effects on our favorite zombie movie? Or let's say do the concept art for the next medieval political TV drama? Or people who plan our weddings. How are we preparing them? How are we preparing the people who are doing the network security for us? Or people who are designing our office spaces? How do we develop their skills? How are we developing people who even take care of our dogs and our pets? Or those individuals who capture those stellar moments, how are we developing them? Or people who are doing graphic design, the next corporate logo, or checking us into our hotel. How do we develop them? Again, people who are mixing and mastering the latest DJ at the biggest dance club, or those who are entertaining us on stage, or I think of, mixing and mastering, let's say, the latest album. Although, come to think of it, wait, do they even make albums anymore, or do millennials kill that too? I mean, I say that in jest, but again, getting back to this idea of how are we developing the next generation? What are we doing? Well, for myself, I was an executive coach working in different industries. I worked in global asset management, banking, commercial real estate, with senior leaders and executives in billion-dollar deals. However, I never actually once worked in those industries. As an executive coach, I didn't have to give them the answer. They were smart people, they had the answer. But as an executive coach, I had to ask the right questions. I had to give them feedback, not on what their response was, but on the thought process and challenge how they framed things. That's what I did as a coach. Now, I just want to take a step back, because as I talk about coaching, I just want to, for me growing up, full disclosure, and it was announced earlier, I'm Canadian, I'm from Canada, and for anyone who grew up, especially playing sports, that idea of what a coach does is maybe a little different. For me, I played hockey, and the rest of the world calls it ice hockey, but it's a bit redundant to call it ice hockey for me, growing up in Canada. But the coaches I grew up with were very different than the executive coach that I became. For me, growing up playing hockey was that coach yelling at me and telling me what to do and how to do it. If I wasn't holding the stick right, they would grab the stick and tell me what to do. Very, very different. Again, how, let's say, the International Coaching Federation would define how you coach and develop. You're not providing the answer, but you're asking those questions, those coach-like questions, to allow that individual to self-direct what the answer is. For myself in my coaching practice, I had 2 questions I'm going to share with you that I used all the time. The first one was always, tell me more. And I loved asking this question because it really allowed that individual to explore that idea, that problem, where they were getting stuck. As well, I also asked, and now what? And I loved asking, and now what? Because I wasn't giving that individual the answer. No, it was up to them to come up with the answer and the solution themselves. And as a coach, I would challenge them and ask them questions about that. And I loved it. Now, when it came to the M word question, or the millennial engagement question, when I asked them, tell me more, oh, I got an earful. They'd go on and on and on about the millennial issue. But when I asked them, and now what? Deafening silence. It was interesting. As we went on and talked about it, a lot of the senior leaders would say, well, because of that lack of engagement, maybe we need to, have better lunches, and then freer lunches, and free beer, and foosball tables for everybody. But that was very superficial and didn't really hit at the heart of what the issue was. And as an executive coach, I coached all over North America, from Toronto to Houston, from New York to Vancouver to Montreal. I even had clients in Sweden, I had a client in South Africa. I even had a client in Iran, of all things. And it was interesting because that millennial question came up all the time across different nations and cultures about how do you engage with this next generation. And I don't think we actually fully came still yet to a right solution for it. Well, at that time, as I was doing a lot of traveling, I was wetting the bed every night. Not necessarily in that sense, but I was literally soaking the bed from the head to the toes. So I went to go get that checked out at the hospital. Anyway, yada, yada, yada. It turns out I have this form of incurable lymphocytic leukemia. And as I was going for the testing, which was really actually quite interesting, and where this aha moment came for me was at the hospital that I was at. It was a teaching hospital. So the senior oncologist asked if his med students could be with me that day as they were going through all the process. So it was a long day, and of course I said, okay, sure, I'll do this. It's a great learning opportunity for these young students. Lying on that table, that cold table, it was actually kind of crazy. Having 12 strange millennials touch me in places, I'll be honest, I'd never want to be touched by strangers ever again. But as I was lying there, what really intrigued me was how that senior oncologist prepared that next generation of doctors. Not once did he tell them what to do and how to do it. No. He asked them questions. He provided feedback, not on what they said, but on their thought process. And as he was asking them questions, it hit me, what he was doing was exactly what I did as an executive coach. He challenged them to come up with the answers themselves. And it really got me thinking. Anyway, we decided, I was living in the big city in Canada, and I decided, you know what, we need to change. So my husband and I, we decided we're going to leave, and we moved to the interior of British Columbia, which, by the way, is absolutely fabulous. And we took our little dog, and I absolutely love it. If you ever get a chance, go. The mountains are beautiful. It's just absolutely fabulous, and it was really great to slow down. But I was like, you know what, I'm not dead yet. I'm still got lots of years left. I think I can do this. Turns out, in this town that I was in, there was a small post-secondary digital arts school that had a program for professional development to develop these soft skills. But they had heard about executive coaching, and they thought, you know, would you be interested in bringing that to our school? Now, and mind you, this school was very different than maybe what I had experienced when I went to school. These are individuals that, you know, have a very defined career path in terms of where they're going, very small classes. But, you know, when I went to university, it was in a lecture hall kind of like this, with a lot of people, and there was a subject matter expert at the front, the professor, who would download information to them, and you know, I would busily write notes and then go off to the next class. Very different in terms of what these students would experience. So let me tell you about my first 2 weeks before coaching, I guess BC, if you will. I was a little overwhelmed. It was a wave, no, it wasn't a wave. It was a tsunami of students who would come into my office, and I actually had, okay, this sounds horrible. I had a sliding scale for the level of distress these students were in. I had, you know, they just wanted to come in and chat. The mildly distressed, they weren't crying at first, but if I asked a question, they'd break out into tears. Then I had the crier's crier. Then I had the full-on meltdown snodder everywhere, all over my floor. And this one in particular case, one case study I followed, this one individual came into my office in a 2-week period 34 times. So that was averaging 3.2 visits a day. Over 30% of those were at the Snotter level. But what was happening with this individual? They were coming in with a problem and then expecting a subject matter expert to provide the solution. Well, if that behavior continued in the workforce, that would be very career limiting for that individual. So what I did is I took a very different approach. Again, as someone who's battling cancer, I took a no excuses approach. There was no excuses with me. It was, and now what? What is your now what? What do you focus on? Now, I have to admit, it was a process. It did take a while. But in one semester, I got that down to 1 visit a week. But that one visit was not a meltdown. It was an update on what they were facing and what they did. And then feedback, how are we doing? And it was excellent. Now I'm safe to say that this individual hasn't even graduated yet and is actually working in the industry. I am saving a ton on tissues, by the way, and on carpet cleaning. But I'm really happy to say that this individual, I think, is going to be able to move into their career very, very successfully. Let me tell you about another group of students I have. It's also an animation school. And these animators, I know I said I wasn't going to make generalizations earlier, but if I worried about the animators, socially awkward and play too many video games. But these are individuals that, yes, they're going to have to learn some very specific technical skills in order to produce the things that they need to produce. Another thing that's very, very important for them, especially for the animation studios that are going to be hiring them, is the animation studios want to make sure that these are individuals that can work well with others. So one of the things that the school does in collaboration with the people who are hiring them is we bring our students throughout the program on what we call them tours of all the animation studios, both in the small town as well. We make a road trip quite frequently out to the big town of Vancouver so they can see the big animation studios in the big city. What was interesting is even though we ran lectures on your behaviors, what to expect, what we expect the students to do before the tour and during the tour, let me tell you, what would happen without fail every single time is the students, they were like a congealed group of kitty litter that would come into the tour, be petrified while they were there, never ask any question, not be engaging, and then as soon as the tour was over, leave. So the studios never really got a sense of who they were and their personality, which was so important. So I said, no, you know what, we're gonna introduce some coaching. Individually, sat down with every student. And what I asked was, how do you want that studio to feel about you? And now what? Now what will you do? And it was interesting because what the students came up with themselves was far superior than what we did. The students had this whole social media engagement strategy beforehand where they would reach out online. And they even had this competition around who had the most robust questions to ask. Then when they were in the tours, they were very engaging. They conducted informational interviews on their own. They went out and tried to really practice the handshake and really put themselves out there. And then afterwards, they even had an online social media engagement strategy afterwards to keep those connections that they made at that studio warm. Again, not from me telling them what to do. The behavior changed when we just simply started asking them and putting the solution in their hands and allowing them to own it. It's very, very different. And happy to report in this last graduating class, we had 18 students, 11 of them, even before graduation, had jobs lined up for them, which is fabulous. I want to tell you one more story. This is interesting. We also have event planners at this school. Very passionate group of individuals. And they were planning this huge event in their final semester up on one of the mountains. And they were so proud of it. They'd come in every day about all this exciting things that they were going to be able to do up on this mountain event that was going to involve the city. There'd be lots of people there. It was just going to be absolutely fantastic. Well, in my home province of British Columbia this summer, we had the worst fire season in history. What that meant was, even though we didn't have any fires nearby, the mountain was at high risk. So at the very last minute, their event was canceled. Well, these students were devastated. They only had less than 2 weeks left in their semester before they graduated. It's interesting, because even though we talked about things like conflict management, they still had lots of conflict. Even though we had a lecture on preparing for your interview and having stellar success stories to share in your interview, nobody made that connection until I sat them down and said, okay, now what? And it was interesting what they came up with. They actually, on their own, at the very last minute, prepared this whole celebration to honor the firemen and firewomen battling those fires this summer. It was absolutely amazing. They were able to raise lots of money from it. And now, when they go into the job interviews, which actually they're doing right now, is they're sharing this as a success story and framing it. But it came from not me telling them, it came from just asking the question. So what I'm gonna put out there is this challenge to the world, for my generation, in fact, for anybody. When we look at how are we developing the next generation, do we tell them what to do and how to do it? Or do we take that executive coach mindset out of the boardroom and bring it into the classroom when you're looking at developing the next generation, where they're looking at whether they're getting promoted? That's gonna be my challenge, is how can we become more like coaches to help develop the next generation? And as well, I have to give a big shout out. In terms of the now what, it was my students who put this presentation together, so I want to thank them so much for that. Thank you. Cheers.